Welcome to Second Take, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. The Department of Trade and Industry has released draft legislation and a policy document on the creation of so-called special economic zones. Terence Creamer joins me to discuss the concept. Terence, welcome to Second Take. What is government envisioning with the Special Economic Zones Bill, and how will these nodes differ from industrial development zones?
Well, I think there's been a review of the industrial development zones over the last few years, and they've found that while they've delivered somewhat, so 11.8 billion rands worth of investment, 40 investors in these separate zones, and about 33,000 jobs created, but many of those construction-related jobs, so not permanent jobs. They haven't really delivered to the potential that government wanted in terms of creating industrial infrastructure that will crowd in foreign and domestic investors. And these zones currently exist in places like Kruger, which is the big one in the Eastern Cape, East London, Richards Bay, and then we've also always hear about the OR Tambo International Airport Zone, but that actually hasn't ever been operationalized. There was supposed to be a jewelry hub around the airport, and what they really are about is having duty-free inputs coming in and converting those inside the zones and then exporting them. So it's they really re-export places, or places that are focused on external markets. And I think that the review found that there are a lot of opportunities to develop new types of industrial parks. So it's real industrial infrastructure. So you concentrate a lot of companies in one area, either sector specific. So you could have platinum types, beneficiation type projects, which they're looking at, say, for instance, producing the fuel cell in one zone, or you could have more, generic industrial parks where there's a lot of different types of activity, or science parks. And these don't, and agricultural processing facilities. So these don't necessarily have to be related to export markets. They could be for domestic consumption. So immediately the industrial development zone concept doesn't really work. So they're looking at these new types of special economic zones, looking at different regions. So all these IDZs have been around airports and ports. So we can look at Limpopo province, and we can look at Free State province and Mpumalanga to really service either the immediate domestic market or the hinterland or even regional markets into sub-Saharan Africa. So I think there's a whole new thinking and trying to facilitate that. So there's a new framework that's being put in place that looks at setting up special economic zones for those purposes, and setting up concentrated industrial infrastructure to crowd in investment. And I think that there's also been a view that the IDZs were funded in a very ad hoc manner, sometimes through provincial governments, sometimes through the national budgets, sometimes through public-private partnerships. So this bill suggests that we create a sort of comprehensive fund which can support not just feasibility studies of new zones, but also implementation of those zones. So there's a whole new thinking. There'll also be a board that looks at how do we go about licensing these new nodes on industrial hubs, and there'll be set criteria around that. And it even looks like the incentives within the zones, where it was really a one-size-fits-all incentive of the past, there might be tailored incentives depending on how the zone is being set up. What, say, an agri-processor needs versus a platinum beneficiator might need a different type of incentive. So there's a lot of that sort of thinking that has to take place. And there's now a period of public comment which will take place over the next few months. And the Department of Trade and Industry is hoping to take this into Parliament during the course of this year, and for this Act to go through Parliament and be enacted by the end of the year.
There has been much talk about a new IDZ at Saldanha. Is this still on the cards given this new development?
Yes, I think Saldanha they're seeing as the first of the new model, the new type, even though it's going to be an industrial development zone, not a special economic zone, and might actually precede the legislation going ahead, because they might want to operationalise Saldanha ahead of the actual Act going through Parliament. But it draws on a lot of the principles and values that are inside of the framework and the policy document. especially the interrelationship between national government, or the national department being DTI, the municipality down at Saldanha Bay, and the Western Cape government. That's quite ironic because it's a DA administration in both, and then you have the national department saying this is a model. But I think that's actually a very good thing. It's outside of a sort of ANC stronghold, and looking at a lot of opportunities for new industries in Saldanha Bay. And the idea there is going to be an export and domestic market type approach, which brings in this new thinking that is not just low-cost inputs or duty-free inputs and then for export market. It's because they're looking at green industries, and that would really be to supply the domestic market, because we've got a big green industry or renewable energy program that's starting to happen. So we're really talking about turbine blades or molds going up there. We see one of the companies that are set up at the port of Cape Town looking at Saldanha Bay as probably their permanent location if this zone develops. But then we're also looking at aquaculture type projects. Oil services could be quite a big thing for Saldanha Bay because it's got the deep water harbour already. And there's potential to do a lot of oil servicing for the West Africa. So Angola is a big oil hub now, so is Ghana becoming an oil producer, and you've got Nigeria. And these rigs are generally going back to Asia to be, restored and maintained. And if South Africa can capture some of these oil rigs and start doing the servicing and start supplying from a place like Saldanha, it makes a lot of sense. So I think Saldanha is very much on the cards. And I think what we're going to see, well, the feasibility study, the full feasibility study is underway now. We've had the pre-feasibility study last year. That should be completed, they say, by mid-year, June. And once that is complete, there'll be, the economic case, yes or no, do we go ahead with this hub? And I think at this stage it's looking favourable for that to go ahead. And they may want to move ahead of the new legislation, but as I said before, bringing in a lot of the principles and values from the new policy.
How does the proposed SEZ legislation dovetail with other policies designed to stimulate reindustrialization?
Well, I think that is the overarching mantra now, with not only in the Department of Trade and Industry, but also the Economic Development Department and more National Treasury. We need to reindustrialize South Africa. So we've had the consumer saving us for long now in terms of keeping our economic growth going, but it's not a sustainable model. We need the productive sectors of mining, agriculture and manufacturing to really start punching their weight. We've been losing mining and agricultural output, and its contribution to GDP has been falling, and manufacturing has been decimated, more or less, from being close to 30% contribution to GDP to closer to 14% now. So there's a view this is not sustainable. We need these sectors to come back into this economy, and in particular manufacturing. Now, it's happening at a time where everyone in the world is thinking the same way, whether you're Barack Obama or whether you're back in Europe, you're wanting to sustain and rebuild your manufacturing base. So there's going to be a lot of competition around that. So South Africa is looking at ways to make themselves attractive to investors, and one of them is to have the industrial infrastructure in place. So the industrial development zones, the special economic zones, to say there's places here there you don't have to worry about your bulk water supply, your bulk electricity, your roads, and you're going to be integrated and close to markets, plus you're going to get duty-free access, plus there'll be incentives, maybe beyond the generic incentive packages. But that still needs to play itself out, because we've got the February budget coming up, and Pravin Gordhan needs to elaborate on the additional 25 billion that he's going to be making available to support manufacturing specifically and the reindustrialization of the economy. And we're going to have to see whether our incentives are going to be attractive to re-stimulate manufacturing investment. And as I said, it's going to be competitive. There are a lot of countries looking at it. But I think there is this thinking that, we have this opportunity on our doorstep of Africa. A lot of the products that we could produce for our own infrastructure programs could have application in Africa. Africa, unlike being based in Europe, is growing. I mean, we're still talking about 5% plus growth in Africa for the rest of the year. So it's a market that we're starting to tap, but isn't fully tapped. So we need to not just have these, for instance, outward focused zones where you make automotive for Europe. where you could make infrastructure components for the rest of Africa, I think is more the thinking. So along with the special economic zones, we've seen sort of the local procurement accord, the new growth path, the industrial policy action plan, already geared towards looking at those markets of Africa as well as the emerging markets of the BRICS, and saying that we need to start gearing our manufacturing and not just our mining, but also our manufacturing industries towards those fast-growing markets rather than our traditional, which we don't want to erode at all, but rather than our traditional markets, mainly of Europe and the US, which are not going to be growing as fast for the foreseeable future. So it does dovetail with that quite neatly. And I think there's going to be a lot more action around industrial policy plans this year as we've seen them evolving. What we need to see is some not just the policy thought and the support in words, business, government, labor, they all support these in words. But we need to start seeing some real action in the manufacturing space so that this continual erosion of its contribution to gross domestic product is captured at last, and there's a collar put to it, and we start seeing some upside. Now, most economists are saying we're unlikely to see that this year. We saw the PMI coming out yesterday; it's below 50 again. So the immediate prospects don't look great. But I think what we're talking about here is more about long-term, putting in the scaffolding for a long-term return of industrialization to this economy, and a long-term sort of creating the favorable conditions for the productive sectors to start punching their weight again.
Terence, thank you very much. That is the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis.